Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well.
Good.
I want to visit with you on the subject of the Russians.
Oh, no.
Poisoning their people, and they have to crack down. And our friend at the State Department sent out a message, really looks bad. Of course, we thought this was all cleaned up about Novichok and the Skripals, but all of a sudden, we have to go back to this, and now they're going to be punished. And it's really a mixed bag. Who's on whose sides? It sounds like the State Department is competing with Trump. Mm-hmm. Sort of like sometimes I think Trump has to compete with his Justice Department. It's all over again. And who's on whose side? And where are the neocons lurching? They seem to be infiltrating the government.
Yeah.
And they certainly have the ear of the media, or they control the media. And I think right now what we might be looking at is this fight going on between the United States and Russia over sanctions and all this is in many ways it looks like Trump is in a corner, has to pander a little bit to the media. At the same time, it doesn't look like he's enthusiastic about what they're doing, but people are demanding something be done. So right now, it looks like we're on the verge of escalating the sanctions war, which never made any sense and could get out of hand one of these days.
The thing is, the neocons, we have accepted that Trump is not a neocon necessarily. But the neocons are running circles around him. There's no question about it. And this is another example of it. This is Pompeo making a determination that what happened in Salisbury in March triggered this act, and we can talk about it later, forcing these sanctions, these 2 rounds of sanctions to kick in according to this 1991 law. And basically the president's hands are tied. There's not much he can do. He does have a lot of leeway to waive these sanctions, and this is under he invoked the name of the act is Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act of 1991 is what kicked in. Pompeo kicked it in, and the president can waive these, but then it becomes political, and we should talk about that later. He is in a bind.
Yeah, he sure is. But the absurdity of all this, we passed a law that's, in 1991 that says that, people use these chemical weapons that we should look into and punish them. But that's a U.S. law. But what we're talking about is something that happened almost a year ago in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And we're punishing somebody, which is the Russians, for doing it. We have no proof of anything. They've gone through this. There's no new information. So it's a so-called crime committed in another country, and now the United States, under one of our laws, decides that it's our obligation to punish them, and they have not been really, well, in the public they've been charged, but there's been no official charges, no official proof of anything of what has happened, and now this is escalating into a major event between two most powerful nations in the world with nuclear weapons. But I think, and in our title today, I think the real culprit here is Pompeo.
Yeah.
I mean, he did this, and maybe Trump said, well, I guess I got to go along with this because, I'm getting beat up pretty badly, over me being too friendly with the Russians. Mm-hmm. So he's playing that game. But seems to me this is the time when you need strength and confidence and not back off. If you're right, you're right, and you should stick to it. But the other side of it is, if you're getting beaten up and you do it, and then they beat you up even worse, and that, I guess, could be his concern. The elections are coming up, and if it looks like he's a wimp on Russia, that it might hurt the Republicans. But I think the goal ought to be to get the truth out about this, and let the people know what's going on, so that the American people don't say to our politicians that unless you beat up on the Russians, you're not a good American. that's what it's gotten to be. And the Russians are the whipping boy. And this looks like there's going to be some escalations, and there may be some carve-outs. Maybe Trump will back off on some of them since he has the power to waive something, and maybe the Russians will hold off too, because their biggest weapon probably is, we're not going to send you any more rockets, but that hurts them, and they're involved with a company that involves Boeing and Lockheed.
Yeah.
So you talk about complexity. If it's the neocons submerged throughout the economy and the media, and they're also submerged in these trade agreements, it looks like it's not going to be resolved quickly, because it gets more complicated as time goes on.
Well, anyone who spent any time looking into the Skripal case, even objectively, would know that there are some serious problems with the narrative. And in fact, the UK narrative, the UK government narrative, has changed over and over and over. Oh, it was, so Novichok was on the door. No, it came in through the air conditioning. No, it was in his Cheerios in the morning. Over and over it changed. So at the very least, there are some huge questions about what has been implicated by the UK government. So here comes the U.S., as you point out, here comes the U.S. acting under a 1991 law, playing judge, jury, and executioner without the facts. The facts are absolutely unproven. It's the most absurd thing I think you could ever imagine.
It's a shame that the bully pulpit isn't used to emphasize. I'm not use the term anymore, but this fake news stuff. Yeah. Just go out there and say this isn't true. You haven't any proof, and why do we have to be bullied around? But they're on Hedge. They were quoting somebody from the mission that we have there. We're not allowed to have an embassy anymore, since we're breaking up all relationships with Russia. But there was one quote that caught my attention, because they were getting orders from the State Department, which is Pompeo. So the mission gets here and saying this is what's going to happen. So the mission, they're supposed to be diplomats and knowing what's going on and why. So I think they asked the question, why are we doing this? And the answer here is, and this is in quotes, we have grown accustomed to not hearing any facts or evidence. So that's one department of our government talking about the other part of the government. So there's a lot of healing that needs to be done, I think, in our government.
Here's another good quote. Was also in one of the articles. Dmitry Trenin of the Carnegie Moscow Center, he captures the whole idea. He says, sanctions are the U.S. weapon of choice. They are not an instrument, but the policy itself. So they're not an instrument of the policy, they actually become the policy. But the thing about this, and there was a briefing, the State Department held a briefing for the journalists about this new round of sanctions, invocation of this 91 Act. And one of the lapdog media actually had the temerity to ask, what's going on here? Is there new evidence? What's triggering this? Has something new come out that we don't know about? In the State Department briefer, I'll just read it to you. It's amazing, this admission. He said, I'll leave it to others to characterize the current state of our understanding of the Skripal affair. We've been clear that we agree with the assessment. We agree with the assessment that it was Novichok agent and that the perpetrator was ultimately the Russian Federation. That didn't say we've determined. We agree with the assessment. That means we take what the UK says as gospel. So they didn't do their own investigation. And then he said, I'll leave it to others to give the kinds of details of what is currently understood. So he has no clue. He has no clue. Pompeo has no clue. They haven't done an investigation. They haven't determined it themselves. All they know is that the UK government, Theresa May, who's in all kinds of political trouble herself, said it. They got to point to the Russians, and that's it.
Well, in a way, I see this as a bit of a rescue operation for rescuing May, because she was beaten up over this issue, and it was accepted that there was a lot of falsehoods. But here they're going back to it like nobody has a memory, nobody's allowed to ask the same questions. So it looks like they want to salvage her career, so she picks up a couple points here. Oh yeah, maybe she was right all along, because the Americans agree with her now, and they're going to punish the Russians. But I think there must have been something there that she won the internal fight over.
Something. And let's delve into the sanctions a little bit, because these are stipulated in the 1991 law. So we know from that law what happens. The first round kicks in after 90 days, which they're over the deadline, but that doesn't bother them. The first thing, it would further restrict tech exports to Russia. They're already restricted, but they'll further restrict them to include nearly all electronics and engines and things. Those will all be restricted. And then in the 90 days after this, unless Russia agrees to stop using chemical weapons, which is, you think about this, it's almost like, when did you stop beating your wife? You better agree to stop using them. Well, we didn't use them in the first place. It doesn't matter. You better agree to stop using them. If they don't agree to stop using them and permit international inspections of their facilities, the next round of sanctions are even more draconian. Has to do with more severe financial penalties, bank loans, prohibition of importing or exporting oil or gas to or from Russia, prohibition of landing rights for Russian carriers. Russian passenger jets can no longer land. And ultimately, and this I think is essentially an act of war, complete suspension of all diplomatic relations.
Right.
It's pretty heavy stuff.
This looks to me like reversing what we believe in, and that is trade. Trade is good. Sanctions and on any country, Cuba or Russia or China or whatever, is not good and leads to bigger problems. So the Cold War ended and trade began. There was a lot of trade. There's a lot of activity, a lot of investment, and the corporations are involved. And the Europeans like energy from Iran, and they like it from Russia. So all this seems to be doing is eliminating the wonderful results of trade. Trade, we argue, prevents hostilities.
Yeah.
People become dependent on each other, and they share information. They understand people better. So if you look at all this business that we're talking about, whether it's Iran or Russia, it's always a seem to destroy any movement of the slightest amount, toward peaceful relationship. We have to get rid of it. So they keep trying to reverse this, and this is up again for no logical reasons. They have to concoct these crazy schemes of the Russian government poisoning people from perfume bottles and things like that. It just makes no sense. It's amazing that so many people go along with this, but I guess, I don't know, maybe half the people believe the Russians are bad people, and the other half believe we ought to talk to them, but not in the media.
No.
If you went by the media, 90% of the people say, oh, the Russians are the bad people, and we have to do this. We can't wait. We can't be Neville Chamberlain and let them get ahead. And what happens to the people who speak out? They have a difficult time, and of course we know what that is about. But right now, you take what Rand has to go through, because he's taken a position which is rare. He has never been, even though I think he might have voted for Pompeo, he was never a champion of Pompeo. So to speak out like that and even suggest when Trump is doing something good like we have, they'll beat up on him or anybody else who even suggests this. I mean, you don't get on a major news network. Yeah. If you take this position to talk about foreign policy, there's only been one station that finally said to me, if you want to talk about foreign policy, you're welcome on our show. It happens not to be an American station.
Yeah, exactly. But you talk about what the American people believe. We've had a couple of shows where we've talked about the polls. People overwhelmingly supported Trump's diplomacy with Putin. I think 97% of Republicans want to have another summit. So they're off on the rails. I think this is very political, and I would actually go as far as to say this is a political coup by Pompeo against Trump. Because what he's done, Pompeo and the neocons have invoked this law and thrown the ball back to Trump, and he'll have to either allow these sanctions to go through, or he'll have to waive them right around the time of the November elections. He's handed a huge piece of gold to the Democrats for November, because if Trump tries to say, well, we're not gonna cut off diplomatic ties, then say, there he goes, look, it's all political.
Well, look how Russiagate has gotten out of hand. That's actually part of the coup business, because Trump seems to be trapped right now. I mean, we don't really have an attorney general. Yeah. We have an assistant that is not Trump's friend, and he's going to be one of the most influential people because Mueller's report goes to him. So Trump's been neutralized neutralized in this sense. And it blends together the problems that Trump faces with the Justice Department and Mueller. The problem is similar. That's one of the things that helps motivate him to be a little bit cautious. Well, I don't want to throw gasoline on the fire. They're already cooking us. So he has to sort of go back off a little bit instead of just taking his position that the Russians aren't such bad people. We ought to talk to them, things like that. The American, and if it could be played up, you just pointed out the statistics. It shouldn't be that much of a political liability for him if the message was out there. Yeah. It's the fact that on the evening news, so he has to resort to things like Twitter, to get his message out, and sometimes that gets jumbled.
And this is a political trap of his own making, if you think about it. He's the one who put Pompeo in. He's the one who chose these neocons. He's put all these people around him that they're from when they get up and take their first breath in the morning till when they go to bed, all they think of is war. They don't think of trade and commerce and friendship. So I would just end by saying, look, don't take our word for it. We're very skeptical about the Skripal case. Read for yourself. There's a great blog called The Blogmire. This is a fellow who lives in Salisbury, and he has painstakingly gone over every single statement that the police have made, that the government has made about this. And he has pointed out holes in the story you could drive a truck through. His name is Rob Slane. We have a lot of his articles on the Ron Paul Institute website. Go look at some of his stuff, test it against the evidence, test it against what you read elsewhere, judge for yourself. At the very least, you'll say, this is far from conclusive. We're risking a war with Russia over something like this that is not even proven at all. It's insane, Dr. Paul.
No, it makes no sense. And to me, the thing that is hard to understand, it's so unnecessary. There's no need for this unless you have to get into what are they thinking about? What is the goal? Is chaos the goal? Are they really wanting to see a conflict, and why? But it makes no sense. It seems unnecessary. It makes no sense. And besides, if you look at it and understand it, it's a negative. It's a downside for the American people. It's a downside for peace and prosperity. It's a downside for the Russian people. And it's a downside for, just people being able to get along with each other. So in spite of it all, it seems to escalate. We sort of take the case that we don't believe that Trump's really heart is in this, that he's not bulldozing over at the same time. Daniel points out that he has some responsibility. Some of the people that are plotting against him, are not seem to be on his side. So it's going to sort out. We wish it would sort out and gradually get better rather than systematically getting worse. And that's what I sense today. This is making no sense, and conditions are getting worse. And I think a lot behind this is the hatred and the intimidation and the furor over who has power in this country. And the people who have power have wealth. They don't just control the military-industrial complex, they control the Federal Reserve and the bailouts and everything else. So it is that struggle that makes the difference. So a lot of this stuff is probably fluff, and the real issue is power and control by the deep state. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.